All right, it's time for Yogi and the BeachMan. Hi, I'm Jim the Yogi.
And I'm Rick Beach the BeachMan.
We're two Michigan transplants now living in Southwest Florida.
In fact, we're cousins born in 1964, just a month apart.
I like to meditate.
And I like to play bass in a band.
I'm into chanting Om.
And I'm into throwing down some classic rock.
But together, we're on a mission
to promote people that are helping other people.
We want to make the world a better place.
One conversation at a time.
So sit back,
turn up the volume,
and get ready to laugh.
Because we like to have fun
while we spread the love.
Interviewing lovely people. Yes, we have fun.
Welcome back to this week's episode of Yogi and the BeachMan. Today we are with Roy Thibodeau. He's a yoga instructor from Michigan, and we're excited to have you on the show, Roy.
Yeah, how you doing, Roy?
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely.
I forget your cousin. Is it cousin?
Yeah.
I forgot his name already. Hi, Rick.
That's okay.
I won't forget now.
You gotta start taking that magnesium.
Yeah, I do.
So Roy, tell us a little bit about what you do in the yoga world.
I've been a yoga teacher for over 50 years, but a
Wow.
lot of that time I couldn't really teach actively because I was raising a family and had a career. And I started teaching pretty seriously maybe 15 years ago. So I teach 7 classes a week and at various places in the community. I teach meditation, and my wife and I have a meditation group and a Sunday service we do.
Very nice. So you started teaching 50 years ago. Is that
52, actually.
52? That's impressive. That is really amazing. If you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
76.
Wow. All right. That's fabulous. And last time I saw you, you were still doing amazing yoga postures. Like definitely not something most people your age could do.
Well, to be honest, I still can do all of them, but I don't do them that often because it's, I don't get to practice by myself all that much, although Marianne and I belong to a local studio here. And so we take classes just to keep ourselves physically sharp. But as I've gotten older, my students have gotten older. So the classes I do teach now are fairly gentle. In fact, 3 of my classes each week are chair classes, and that's become really popular. I taught one today, had 50 people in my chair class today.
Wow, that's fabulous.
And
Do
that's
this stuff at your
chair
house,
yoga.
or do you have a studio dedicated to this, or where do you do this at?
Well, when we started, Jim knows a little bit of our background. We were, back in 1972, there wasn't a whole lot of yoga being done. And our guru, Yogacharya Black, started our association back in the middle 60s. And he used that as a way of introducing people to more serious yoga meditation. And we probably had, I'd say we had close to 100 teachers in the Detroit area. And the way we did is we'd find a place that we could rent. We put up posters and word of mouth, and we just start classes in rooms that we would rent. So we also started that way, but what we've done lately, since in the last 10 years or so, 15 maybe, we find places that are looking to offer yoga classes, and then we teach there. And we don't do it to make a living. It's more of our vocation, you might say. And they pay us, it's gone up a little because of inflation, but they pay us anywhere from $35 to $50 an hour to teach the classes. So we teach here, both Marianne and I teach 6 classes at the Grosse Pointe Woods Community Center. I teach 2 classes at Wayne County Community College. And then I teach at a local place. It's like it's owned by a health insurer, and but it's an old club in Grosse Pointe, neighborhood club, and they do a lot of physical therapy and a lot of physical exercise classes. They have all the equipment, and they also offer quite a few yoga classes. And I teach a chair class there Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Awesome.
It's gotten so big, they have a class where most of the yoga classes are in a smaller room, but it got too big, so they moved it to the gym, and they had to buy some more folding chairs.
Hey, good to hear it's growing.
Yeah, I'm amazed actually.
Do you remember your first yoga class
That I took or that I taught?
that you took?
I do actually.
You want to tell us about that?
I
What year was it?
1972.
Okay.
I just graduated from college from Western Michigan University in December of 71. And
Go K Wings
yeah, really.
or Broncos, I mean.
Well, the K Wings too. There's a
Yeah.
minor league team there.
Mm-hmm.
But my last year of college, my roommate found a book in the library on Hatha Yoga. And he brought it home and he said, "Do you want to try this?" I said, "Sure, why not?" Looked interesting. So he and I started doing Hatha Yoga postures together. We didn't know what we were doing, but so something to keep us in some sort of shape. And in December, I don't know if you know Jeff and John Waltz or not. Did you ever meet them?
Yeah. Yeah, I met, I think Jeff Waltz. Yeah.
Well, his brother John and I grew up together, and Jeff was his older brother. So I've known him since I was 8 years old. And they got me involved through Edgar Casey, if you know Edgar Casey.
Yeah.
And I read quite a bit of his stuff. And then when I graduated, John came by and gave me the Autobiography of a Yogi as a combination Christmas graduation gift. And after graduation, mid-December, I moved back to my parents in Detroit, Sterling Heights, actually. And I didn't have a job yet, so I had a lot of time, and I read the whole book through in that time that I had, and I was really taken by it. That was really the start of my journey. So I was curious in Kriya Yoga, so I wrote away for their weekly lessons right away.
Mm-hmm.
And during, I don't know, the next 2 or 3 months, went to a class at UD, University of Detroit, which is at McNichols and what's the other street? Livernois. And there was a ashram there run by Swami Satchitananda's group.
Oh, no kidding.
And they had a Hatha Yoga teacher there. So I took a class. It's the only class I took before. In March of that year, Jeff drove into town. We were hippies back then,
I can't imagine you being a hippie, Roy.
That was a brief time in my life. Had long hair and a beard.
Okay.
And he was coming into town and he said, "I heard there's a meditation group that meets in Detroit. Do you want to go?" And I come into town. So I said, "Sure." I wanted to meet some, I never knew anyone who meditated. So he came in and we went down there and we went to the Sunday service at the Art Institute and in the auditorium. And it was dark. You always turn the lights down at the beginning, and there weren't any windows, so it was dark in there. And it was fairly crowded, and we were late like good hippies would be. And we had trouble finding a seat in the dark. And finally we did. And Mr. Black would sit on the stage and there would be a light on the stage. That was the only light in the auditorium. And of course, we didn't have any idea who he was. And I remember when we left, because he used to talk through most of the meditation, giving quotes from the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, and the Upanishads that he had memorized. And I remember when we left, we looked at each other and said, "Who is that little old guy on the stage? And why wouldn't he shut up? Didn't he realize we're trying to meditate?" So I started to go every Sunday because I didn't know anyone else, but I
Mhm.
didn't know anyone down there. So I would go, and then right after I would leave. And the third time I was there, Betty Howard. Do you remember Betty?
I met her, yeah.
She was from Chicago, and she on a monthly basis would have a caravan of cars that drove from Chicago just to come to Mr. Black's Sunday service. And she grabbed me by the elbow as I was leaving, and she says, why don't you come downstairs with us? That, we get together and have, coffee and tea and cookies and sandwiches and things. So I said, sure, why not? So I went down there, and he would sit at a long, like 4x6 table, and people would be gathered around. And when we went down there, it was probably 7,500 people there. And, it was kind of noisy because they were all friends and talking. And then it would start to quiet down, and he would talk about things and generally have a good time as well. And so Betty took her chair and put it just off his right shoulder. And when I got there, he was telling a story about an experience he had with James Lynn Rajasi. And I thought, oh my God, this guy knew Yogananda. And and when I sat down, he turned and he looked at me, and we locked eyes, and I thought, oh, this is my guru. And so from that point on, I was part of that entourage, you might say. And then I went up in December of that year to be on staff. And the following year, I got training when I was on staff to become a yoga teacher.
Excellent.
So I never really, in that time, went to any other classes, but it was a good class, the one I went to at the Swami Satchitananda's ashram. It's a good class.
Yeah. So, can you tell our listeners about Oliver Black, like even how he started, how he met Yogananda, and so forth? Because he was
Sure.
quite an amazing guy even before he met Yogananda, right?
Who's Yogananda? Start with that.
Paramahansa Yogananda. He's the author of Autobiography of a Yogi. He came from India to basically to teach yoga and to you could probably say it better than I can, Roy, but basically to show that Catholicism or religion, as it here was in the West, completely integrates with yoga. Did I say that right?
Yeah, I think that's close enough. Yeah, he's probably his book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, is considered a spiritual classic these days, and it's sold millions and millions of copies. Whenever I had a meditation class on Saturday, and whenever I have one, I give them away to the people that attend.
Nice.
But it was an eye opener for me, and it is for many. And I was raised Catholic, and I find that Yogananda and the way he teaches yoga really appeal to a lot of Catholics because
Okay.
he was very devotional. Catholics really don't know much about their religion, but they tend to be devotional.
Mhm.
And when Yogananda explains yoga and religion so well that a lot of Catholics who might be in the process of maybe getting a little discontented or not quite sure about what they believe, it's kind of eye-opening because Yogananda puts it in such practical and scientific ways that Westerners kind of appreciate. We like to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And Yogananda's book is really tremendous for that, for people that are looking for that.
Mhm.
So you
And-
found it connected with more with just the Catholic faith because of the structure. And I mean, I've been to plenty of Catholic masses, especially when I was a kid, but it just seemed like just really formatted and structured. And is that why you think that integrated with Catholicism more so than Protestant religion? Or
I probably put that incorrectly, mostly because I was raised Catholic. But it resonates with almost all Christian religions. Let's put it more that way. He really presented yoga in a way that Christians would understand and appreciate. And for instance, in his books, they have it well footnoted, because a lot of it he has, uses Sanskrit words and Hindu words, and that's a little foreign and puts some people off, but there's a lot of footnotes, and they explain it in a way that is understandable to Christians. He takes great pains to do that, I think, because he understood when he came to America, America was predominantly a Christian nation. In fact, it still is predominantly. And so he couched yoga in the language that Westerners could understand, even more than just Christians. You'll find a lot of Muslims and Jews. He just couched it in a modern terminology that Westerners would understand, I think. Mm-hmm. And that was his mission. He came to the United States in 1920, and he wasn't the first yogi to come to the United States, but he was the first one to come here and stay for a long time. The first one was probably Swami Vivekananda, Ramakrishna's disciple. He came in 1893, and he stayed for about 10 years. And of course, Yogananda was familiar with Vivekananda and the other disciples of Ramakrishna, because some of them were his teachers at a young age. His master Mahasya was his Sanskrit teacher, and he was a disciple of Ramakrishna's. And so when he came in 1920, and basically he stayed here the rest of his life. He went back to India once in 1935 when his guru passed away, but then he came back and spent the rest of his life here. Mm-hmm. And he established with something called Self-Realization Fellowship, which is an organization in Los Angeles. Probably, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here, probably the biggest yoga organization in the world. They have several million members, but they're not yoga like most Westerners would think of yoga. When you say yoga today, most Westerners think of hatha yoga. And really, when in the scheme of things, when you study yoga, you find that hatha yoga really a fairly small part of yoga. Mm-hmm. And meditation and some of the mental aspects are much, much bigger part of yoga. And that's so Self-Realization Fellowship doesn't really do much hatha yoga, hardly any really. They're mostly based on meditation and spiritual things.
Yeah.
And when he came in 1933, he lived in Boston on the East Coast for a while, because that's where he came originally. He was invited to speak at a World Religious Conference, the same one that Vivekananda spoke to actually in 1893. And he was well received, so he stayed and lived in Boston. That's where he met Dr. Lewis, was a dentist there. And I don't know how long it was, but probably in the middle to late 20s, he moved out to California, Los Angeles. And he liked the weather there. It was more like the weather in India. He didn't really care that much for the cold of Boston in the winter. And so they made their headquarters there. And they have, right in downtown LA, they have their headquarters. And it's up in a place they called Mount Washington. It was an old resort that went out of favor, and they bought it probably in the 30s, I suppose. And go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were done there. I was just gonna ask you about to share again about Oliver Black.
Well, here's an interesting tidbit that, Jim, you might even already know, is that Yogananda was born in 93, the same year that Vivekananda spoke at this conference in America. And it turns out that 3 of his main disciples, Dr. Lewis, James Lynn, and Mr. Black, were all born in the same year.
Oh, really?
And so you can, when you know that, you can see these group of souls coming back to start this work in the West. And 3 of them were born in the West and were successful in their own right. Mr. Black, Yogacharya, was a very successful automotive executive of his own business. But James Lynn was much more wealthy and wealthier. And Dr. Lewis was a successful dentist in Boston. And of course, he met Dr. Lewis first because he met him when he came to Boston. He didn't meet James Lynn and Mr. Black at probably about the same time in the early 30s. But he never would really say. He was always coy about some of these things. Probably met him, the best I can tie down is he said one time he met him just before he was 40. So he had to meet him probably in 1932 or 1933. And this was kind of like Yogananda's second wave of disciples, you might say. The first wave weren't really all that successful, and he went through a lot of turmoil in his own life. In fact, he didn't know what to do. Things weren't going well, and he thought maybe he should just move back to India. And he took a little vacation trip to Mexico. And in Mexico, he wrote a poem about it in Whispers from Eternity, his book of poems, of a vision he had. And I forget the name of the city. I think it's on the West Coast, on the Pacific. He had this vision that assured him that he needed to go back to LA and continue the work there, and that Divine Mother and God would help him. And then he met most of the second wave of disciples, which included James Lynn and Mr. Black and Dayamata and the people that carried on self-realization fellowship after he passed. But Mr. Black, it was kind of one of these miraculous things that when they met, Yogananda had been in Washington, D.C. for some function, and he's getting ready to fly back to L.A. And the direct route to L.A. back in those days would have probably been through Indianapolis. And he always used the term Divine Mother, which Yogacharya would say that was his term for the inner voice. He said Divine Mother told him to go to Detroit. And so he changed his ticket and he went to Detroit. And when he got there, he didn't know why he was there. And so he decided he found a telephone book. And he opened the telephone book and he started running his finger down the pages of the telephone book. And he got to this woman's name, Maud Adams, and it stopped. And so he called her. And he had to, when he called her, she answered the phone and he had to describe who he was and why he was calling her. And when he told her his name and it was into yoga, she said, I have a man in my house who teaches yoga. And Yogananda said, well, I need to meet that man. And then they met and they spent about 10 days to 2 weeks together in the Book Cadillac Hotel downtown Detroit, which at the time was one of the finest hotels in Detroit. And he said he taught him a lot. He initiated him in Kriya Yoga, taught him a lot of healing, different healing techniques and stuff before he went. And that was the beginning of their relationship. And most people at the time or later, would say that he was probably Yogananda's first or second most advanced disciples, depending on who you talk to, between him and James Lynn. And Yogacharya said they were together many times. lives many times before in the Himalayas. He said at one point he was Yogananda's teacher, but he fell behind a little bit, and this time Yogananda was his teacher.
So Mr. Black went by Yogacharya. So I heard that at one time he was he was so wealthy, he was the largest public landowner in Michigan. Is that
He
is that true?
was. That is true. Yep. And Yogacharya just means yoga teacher and a teacher of yoga. And Yogananda gave that title to probably 6. I've heard as many as 8, but some kind of left the organization. But I only know of 4, I think. There's one in Mexico City that he named, and there were 4 or 5 others in the US. And he really didn't use the title until he moved up to the retreat full time back, and he opened that retreat in 1970. Before that, he never used it
I know
when he
all
was
about
in
that. You want to
Detroit.
tell the story about that and how that retreat came about?
Well, I don't know if I can tell that very well. He felt that that was his work that Yogananda had given him for the remainder of his life. And being the largest landowner in Michigan, he had much of it was in northern Michigan. He actually had 2 properties that he considered. The ranch is 800 acres, and it was the smaller of the 2. He had a larger piece of property over by Mayo, which was like 6,000 acres, had 6 or 7 lakes on it, a few more buildings than we had at the ranch, but I'm not sure exactly why, but he decided to open the retreat where it is now. Thank heavens. I don't know how we could have managed 6,000 acres. We can barely manage the 800 acres.
Yeah.
But it was a nice piece of property. Had, the Pigeon River goes through it. It was dammed there, so we made our own electricity. His vision for a while was that it would be self-contained, but that became untenable probably when Bob Raymer was there. I don't know. Were you there when we took the dam out?
Yeah, but that was after Raymer. Yeah. Well, I left just before the dam came out.
Yeah, so it's been out for a while, and they hooked up to the electrical grid up there. What probably really was necessary. We couldn't have what we have there now if we were on that dam didn't generate enough electricity.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're
But he
calling it the
said,
ranch, but just so everybody knows, it's Song in the Morning Yoga Retreat Center, which is in Vanderbilt, Michigan,
yeah,
a little north of Gaylord.
yeah, we always called it that. I have a hard time breaking myself of that
Yeah.
habit.
So he started
But
this
back
ranch,
then,
or he started Song in the Morning because Yogananda encouraged him to open a yoga retreat center, correct?
he did. In fact, he said often that Yogananda felt this would be the SRF second headquarters in the US. That never came about, but so many things changed after Yogananda passed because SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship, became a monastic organization. Before that, he had monks and nuns, but many of his highest disciples were householders. James Lynn, Mr. Black, Dr. Lewis, many of the women. Some of the women then became, and some of the men became monks and nuns, but after James Lynn wasn't really a monk either. He was married and he became the second president, but he didn't live that much longer than Yogananda. So after he died, Daimata became the president, and it became purely a monastic organization. So, in fact, at that point, Yogacharya was the only non-monastic that was authorized by self-realization to give Kriya Yoga initiations.
Hmm.
So it wasn't very likely that they were going to open that up for Yogacharya to do that. It's not helpful for the retreat.
So how much time did you spend with Oliver Black, Yogacharya?
Well, I met him in 1972, and I was on staff from 72 to 75. And then I left. Once we moved down here, we weren't able to go up there very often.
Hmm.
So the last 3 years of his life, we only saw him when he came down here for Kriya initiation and banquets. And well, we went up one time. We took our daughter Jaylin, was born when in 1986, and we went up there and had him christen her. So we were up there for that. But I remember the day he passed, Mahasamadhi. Um, we all knew he was elderly. The last time I saw him for a banquet, he was always healthy, but he became so frail. He started to uh, lose his muscular strength, but he was still sharp. His mind was still sharp, but we knew he probably wasn't going to live that long. And I remember it was in September, and I got a call from a fellow I was on staff with, who now lives in Sacramento. And as soon as he called me, it was in the evening, I I knew that was, he just passed. But I never really felt disconnected. I think that's the one thing that you have when you have a real guru in your life. And Yogacharya always said that about Yogananda. He said he never felt really disconnected.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I was with him all that time I was up north. So about 15 years, I think.
So I imagine it had a pretty profound impact on your life. You want to share some of that and how it changed it?
Yeah, life changing. That's what happens to you. There's that saying that you see it in yoga and Hinduism. It says when the disciple is ready to go to the ends of the earth to find their guru, he appears close at hand. And I'm a prime example of that, because who would ever think someone like that would be in Detroit, Michigan?
Right.
I was ready to go to India, and then I met him. And um, it's funny because Jeff Waltz had already been to India. He and his brother gave me the autobiography, and he came back, and I remember after, he's the one that we went down to see him together, but we didn't know who he was. We didn't really go to see him. And then I started going, and I told him, I said, I met my guru and this master in Detroit. And he scoffed. He said, "Yeah, sure, right." But then he came, and Jeff became one of his most ardent followers. He spent a lot of time the last years of his life. He took him on a vacation to Hawaii, all of these things. They come up and take him to dinner. And I didn't have that kind of relationship with him because he was so much older than I was. I looked at him more as my father or grandfather, and he kind of, it was my thing, but kind of intimidated me.
Hmm.
And so when I was around him, I hardly ever said anything. But he was always teaching me, and through different things that he would say, and I never have any questions because yoga kind of answers all your questions, and it isn't about understanding more. It's about having spiritual experiences. And so we had to meditate every night in the lodge, as you know, and he was always there. And a lot of times he'd stay afterwards and talk about spiritual things and talk about visions he had or experiences he had with Yogananda, different things he knew about the Bible and other scriptures. It was quite an education. And But the big thing was that we got to be with him and watch him and see how a real master yogi lives and how he conducts himself. And for me, that was the most important. And much different than I think many beginner yogis think of it. Because he was a Westerner. He was a successful businessman. He was married. He had children and grandchildren. And but yet he was a saint, and but what you began to realize from him is you don't have to be in robes all the time. You don't have to be pronaming all the time. You can live as a Westerner and still be a spiritual yogi. And so that's how I modeled my own life after that. Um, I say still, I had a great family. My dad was a great person. He was a tool maker for Chrysler and good family man. My mother was a great mother. She just passed away last year. She was 96. And but my dad died pretty young. He was 59. But Yogacharya really was more my father or grandfather figure. In fact, when we had Kriya initiations, we were all supposed to write letters to him about, our spiritual progress. And I always, in those letters, I would call him my spiritual father. And he never shirked that responsibility. He never forced himself on anybody in fact, he kind of shied away from, people looking at him in that way. But when you had that connection, he never shied away for it. He took it seriously. And in fact, so seriously, sometimes you wish he'd let up on you because he is an unbelievable taskmaster. And we used to tell these stories, and finally people would say, "You got to stop telling these stories. You're scaring all these young people away from practicing yoga." But he was so tough on us. It was like, yikes. But these great lessons he taught us. One I'll share that I remember, and like I said, I was the electrician there, and where the main house is, you worked in there, and in the basement there was the electrical panel, and when I came, it was all fuses, it was old style, and so I was updating it to a circuit breaker panel. And I was down there and I was working on it. It's about finished actually. I kind of tidying up, making it look neat, and so that it, looked like it was done by a professional. While I was doing it, Yogacharya, I don't think he snuck up on me, but I didn't notice him come and stand behind me. And he said something that kind of startled me. And he gave me a little bit of praise at the beginning. He said, your concentration was pretty good there. He said, but you still need to be aware of what's going on around you. And I remember that almost every day today, because I think that's what yogis do, is they're 100% focused on what they're doing, but there's element of omnipresence in them so that they're aware of everything else, but they focus on what they're doing. And so I try to remember that all the time. It was a great lesson for me, really.
That is a good lesson. What other takeaways, things that stuck with you that you started doing every day or, really molded your life?
Well, the big thing is that we meditate and practice the Kriya Yoga pranayama. So we had to do that every day. And, we did just when you're around somebody like that's the biggest takeaway. That's why yogis have yashrams, so that their disciples can come up and be with them, because some of that stuff is just a transfer of vibration. It's almost you get it through osmosis. And so reading, plus you had the spiritual environment, and I read a lot while I was there. But what I would do is he would talk about different books that he read. So for a while he would talk about Ramakrishna's book, The Gospel of Ramakrishna. And so I read that. I would say in my life, that's the second most important spiritual book I read after the autobiography. It's a great book. And Ramakrishna lived about the same time as Lahiri Mahasya, who was a Param Guru to Yogananda. But Ramakrishna at the time was much better known in India. Lahiri was hardly known at all until Yogananda wrote the autobiography of the yogi.
Mhm.
So I read that, and there's a lot of great, he had 19 disciples, and some of the stories truly remarkable. And Yogacharya would rate after dinner, he'd talk these stories and he'd laugh his head off. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I learned from him is yogis are full of joy and they're happy. And he laughed a lot, and he always said, the same phrase that Yogananda, he said, a saint that is sad is a sad saint. So he laughed a lot. It was infections. He'd get everyone in the room joyous and laughing. And he'd do little kind of miraculous things. And he'd explain, he'd take the mysticism out of a lot of the Bible and the holy books and make it more understandable. A lot of the miracles that really are not really miracles the way most Christians think of them, but that's hard to unwind that from Christianity because it's such an important part of Christianity. And I think even sometimes in the autobiography of the yogi, because there's a lot of miraculous things in that book, that I think Yogananda felt he had to go there to persuade Christians to yoga a little bit. But just as an example, we're all familiar with the story of the 7 fishes and loaves of bread that Jesus multiplied to feed the multitudes. And this is the way Yogacharya explained that miracle. He said, well, you have to understand the customs and the time of the people that Jesus lived in. He said, at those days, they didn't have taverns and inns on the sides of the roads and hotels and motels and restaurants like we have now. So he said, when people traveled, they would carry food and they'd stuff it in pockets in their clothing and stuff. So if they were going on a long trip, they had enough food to get by. And he said Jesus had this charismatic personality and people would follow him around. And he said they went out and they were got farther away from the city, and people were getting hungry, and Jesus saw that, but he knew his own people and how they worked. And he said he knew that some of the people had enough food in their clothing and in their pockets, and some probably didn't. So what he did is he took the bread and water and he used it as a symbol to get the people that had water and food to share it with the people that did. And he said he didn't just multiply fish and bread. He said he knew what his people were like and he knew what they would do. And he said, he said, on the other hand, you have to think it's kind of miraculous that he got people to share what they did with those that didn't have. And, he tell that story to Christians and that doesn't sit too well with them, they're.
No, they're most Christians are, enamored with the miracles that Jesus performed while he was alive, among other things. But so I think that's a story in Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll revisit that later today. See if I can pick those pick that explanation out of the Bible stories.
He had a good friend that wrote a translation of the Bible from the language that they spoke then, Aramaic, and his name was George Lamsa. So he knew him and he helped him he translated it, and you can still find it. George Lamsa's dead, of course, but he translated the original text right from the original Aramaic before it was translated into Greek first, and then from Greek into, the King James version. And he said, the guy told him that a lot of the language they spoke was a simple language. And he said, but you had to know the idioms and how it was used to really translate it properly. An example he gave is in their language, they had a word that had 6 different meanings. One of the meaning was camel, like the animal camel, and another meaning was rope. And he said, for instance, that phrase that we're all familiar with in the Bible, it says, it's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Well, as he said, that's not possible. Camels can't go through the eye of a needle. But he said, if you translate that word differently and it becomes rope, he said, in those times, they didn't have thread like we have now. The thread they have was coarse, and it was made out of hemp, and it could be translated as rope. And it was a little scratchy. He said you had to be careful, but they made their needles to appropriately for that type of thread. So the eyes of these needles were bigger, and said you had to work at it, but you could get it through there. So when you use that interpretation of that word, then it becomes something you say, okay, might not be easy for a rich man to get into heaven, but not necessarily impossible. And he said that's just a misinterpretation of some of the words. And he gave that as kind of an example of how the Bible may have been mistranslated in some areas, not all areas, but plus you have, that's why it's in the yoga tradition, you have guru and disciples, and things are passed down from guru to disciple more orally than any other way. And it's important because when you start translating scripture, it's so dependent on the person that's doing the translation as to what it means. And it depends on the times and the custom in which the person who founded the religion lived. That's why it's important today. That's why Yogananda, I think, and people like him strike such a chord today, is because Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. Our times and culture are so different. And the latest major religion, Islam, and Muhammad lived 1,500 years ago. Such a different time. And so, if Jesus were come today, he would have to know about computers and cell phones and the internet. And don't you think he would be using some of the tools you're using, Jim, to get his message out?
He'd definitely have a podcast.
No doubt about it. Why wouldn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
And things were different. Like young people today, and you can say what you will, but people aren't as attached to the fundamental religions anymore. And I think of my own children who are adults now. Think about the children today. Jesus' parables about sheep and shepherds. My grandchildren probably don't even know what a sheep is, let alone a shepherd. What the heck's a shepherd?
Right.
They would talk in.
They probably know about the goat yoga.
Yeah, they know about goat yoga, right?
Yeah. But and plus the other big problem with Christianity in particular, but all religions teach that our way is the only way. We're the best way. Christianity takes it a step further, and they say Jesus is the only Son of God. But no other religions teach that really, other than Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you study the history of, because I did a little bit of this, and it's really laid out well with Edgar Cayce, is that in the beginning, there was only the Catholic religion. There were all the Protestant religions. And reincarnation, for instance, was part of the Catholic doctrine until 1550 AD at the Second Council of Constantinople. And that's when the East and Western churches split apart. They got together in Constantinople, the Eastern bishops and the Roman bishops, and that's what they determined what books to keep in the Bible. And that's when they took reincarnation out of their teachings, because they thought it gave people too long of a time to repent. You don't have eternity. You got this one lifetime. You better do it now or you're finished. And think of the idea that what could you do that's so terrible that's going to cause you to be in some place we call hell for eternity? You know how long eternity is?
Well, it's pretty clear the answer to that in the Bible.
What is that?
To accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and repent your sins.
So then if you don't, and most of the people in the world don't, then you're damned for eternity. That seems pretty harsh. You think a loving God would do that?
It kind of is harsh. I agree.
I
was just answering your question.
Yeah, no, but it's not a very good answer. It's an answer for their dogma, but it's not a very good answer.
But I'm not a scholar by any choice of the. But doesn't it also say before Jesus returns and the rapture comes that all people of the earth will be able to be exposed to his teachings, so that even those people who aren't exposed will have the choice before the rapture. I think it's Revelation.
And what the Muslims say, if you don't convert to Islam, they're going to kill you or you're going to convert.
Well, Muhammad was also married to a 9-year-old and was responsible for murdering many people, so hundreds and thousands. So,
and I agree. Don't get me going on the Islamic religion, but they are the biggest religion in the world today. They have more members to their faith than any other, including Hinduism and Buddhism.
On the way here, I was listening to somewhere in Texas. They're trying to basically annex a huge area of land that this Muslim group had purchased, so they can basically build a walled compound. They want to make another Branch Davidians, like down in Waco, have their own compound, have their own city, have their own laws, kind of like Disney down here, where they get
Where's this?
their own in Texas.
Oh.
I just heard a little bit about it, and the locals down there are going nuts because they're not going to have any control over the education. And the Muslims have taken over many cities in Europe where they've got into leadership positions, taken it over basically with a 40% minority, but now they're all in because they all vote in certain blocks. So yeah, I'm with you on the Muslim thing.
Well, and the idea, Jesus never himself said he was the son of God, the only son of God. Other people said it about him, but he never said it about himself. In fact, when Pontius Pilate asked him, because they were accusing him of blasphemy, he said, well, you say that, I don't say that. And he said, doesn't the Bible, in his time, because Jesus was a Jew, the Bible was the Old Testament. He said, doesn't the Bible say that ye are all sons of God? So, these things get that's why it's important in the scheme of things to have living gurus and masters on the planet. And Yogacharya said, even in the dark ages, which we've thankfully come out of a little bit, there's at least 2,400 masters on the planet at all times. And Yogananda says, the Gita says, actually, the Bhagavad Gita said, and Krishna's talking to Arjuna's a little distraught because he thinks he's got so long to go to get enlightenment, and he talks about how difficult it is, and Krishna says, out of 1,000 people, one seeks me, and out of 1,000 who seek me, perhaps one knows me as I am. Well, with my background, I took that to heart, and I said, well, 1,000 thousands is 1,000,000. So 1 out of a million. Well, that seems daunting when you think about it. But then you think, well, but I live in Michigan. Michigan has 10 million people. So maybe there's 10 in Michigan. So maybe I got a shot. The United States has 330 million people. So maybe we have 300 plus self-realized people in America. The problem is most of them are not very well known. There are very few people like Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and even Yogananda. Most masters find fame and fortune to be a hindrance in their work. So they keep under the radar, and their disciples find them. And usually, a guru is going to have 10, 15 disciples. That's probably it. Because first of all, they don't want any more because they're not ready. And it creates all kinds of problems for them when they get too well known. You start, can you see NBC out there interviewing, trying to see a miracle,
Yeah. Speaking of miracles, Yogacharya, did you ever see him or hear of him performing miracles?
I did. Miracles are funny things. So most masters don't perform them for the masters. For the masses, they perform them for their disciples to help them. And so what my good friend Jeff, who lives in Sacramento now, we get together through Zoom every week and we're working on this project. But what we see as miracles, other people would scoff at. Well, why do you think that's a miracle? But and most masters or gurus would discount anything people said they were miracles because they don't want that attention, and they give everything to God anyway. Like Lahiri, do you remember the story where he cured the guy's blindness? And he came back and he said, well, I didn't do anything. And he said, yeah, but the God within you did it. And Lahiri said, well, that's different. So one that I real familiar with, I didn't see it, but he told the story a lot, is he had this woman before he opened the ranch. This was back in the 60s. And I'll think of her name in a minute, but her daughter got spinal meningitis. And she was failing. And the doctors said they had done all that they could do for her, and they told the mother to be prepared because the end isn't very far. So she called Yogacharya at home, just losing her mind, you might say. And he listened to her, which he was really good at listening, which you find most spiritual people are. And he said he got real quiet inside. And he said the inner voice told him, he said, tell her that she'll be okay in an hour. And he said he always did whatever the inner voice told him, he just did it. And so he said to her, he said, your daughter will be fine in an hour. And she said, oh, thank you, Mr. Black. Thank you. Thank you. And so they hung up, and she went actually and got a clock and put it next to the bed. And she was sat next to her daughter, and she watched her daughter. And after 45 minutes, her eyes began to flutter, and she opened her eyes, and right at an hour, she got up and she said to her mother, I'm hungry. And she got her some soup, and she never had that problem anymore. She was cured of the spinal meningitis. And Yogacharya laughed. He said he had letters from the woman, telling that. And he said, I don't know. Don't ask me. I don't know how it happened. I was just the messenger. That's what real spiritual people don't ever take credit for much, because there's too much ego involved. And if you're really spiritual, you're trying to get rid of ego, or you've already gotten rid of it, because that's what keeps us away from those kind of things. That idea that we're separate. We're never separate. We're always one with the spirit. And one of the things that I use when I teach spiritual things, not just hatha yoga, you can't do it in a hatha yoga class, but in my meditation class Saturday, I did it is I always tell people, I said, if there are three things that all religions teach, and I always say, if you took all the 5 basic religions and you mixed them all together and you kept the things that were all the same about them and threw out all the things that were different, that would be pretty close to yoga. And I said, there are 3 things that all religions teach, they all agree on. And then said the first, and if they even just followed this first thing that they all agree on, we would solve a lot of problems between religions and dogma. And the first thing is this, that God is omnipresent. All religions teach that. There isn't any that don't. Well, what does that mean? That means there isn't any place where God isn't. So that nice picture of the turtle behind you, you know what? That's God also. God, and I had when I was in business, I was a manager at the pretty big financial company, and I was working with this young black fellow that I was training, and we were late. We were out in the office late. No one else was around. And, I didn't bring these things to the office very much, but, when you're as involved in yoga as we are, it's hard not to talk about them a little bit. And he ended up being a deacon in his church, which was a fundamental, probably Baptist church, I suppose. And he wanted to get into a discussion with me. And I said, he wanted to go on a little bit about hell. And I said, let me ask you this. I said, I'm sure you believe that God is omnipresent, don't you? Oh, yeah. God, everybody knows God is omnipresent. I said, well, God is omnipresent, then God must be in hell also. And I said, maybe hell's not such a bad place to be, and maybe you don't have to stay there. Maybe you're free to leave if you. And he goes, oh, no, that can't be. You start doing these intellectual backflips, trying to make some sense of God being omnipresent and hell.
That's an interesting thought exercise. I would think, if not thought experiment, if nothing else.
And then the next 2 things that every religion believes and agrees on is God is omniscient. He knows everything, knows the number of hairs on your head. He's in every breath. And the third thing is God is omnipotent. He's all powerful. All religions believe those 3 things. And if they would just stick to those 3 principles, even if they only stuck to that God is omnipresent, it would eliminate so much fighting and dogma. Because so much dogma violates those 3 principles.
True.
And the dogma was just created by these priesthoods that are, the religions become political, and the priests are vying for power. And it's just the Pope is the top political position in the Catholic Church. And that's what it is. They vote on who's the Pope. You think God asks their permission for who's a master and who's not? I doubt it.
Right.
You gotta wait for that white smoke.
Yeah. And then the fourth, yogis add a 4th thing that religions don't add, but I think is the most important, really. And that is God is ever new, ever changing, eternal bliss and joy. Because who cares if you're omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent if you're not happy? Can you imagine God not being happy? Who would want to be God?
Good point. I find the big difference between yoga and religions, 2 big differences. Yoga kind of unites everybody. Religions kind of separate everybody. And religions has all the dogma, but they don't really teach you how to make a connection with God. Yoga teaches you how to make that connection.
Oh, I don't agree with that at all.
What is it? How does it teach you to connect with God?
By fellowship and Bible study and prayer.
Okay.
If you don't learn to meditate, you're not going to find God.
Right.
That's the problem. And they talk about meditation, but they don't teach any techniques. And they
Right.
don't even define what meditation is. The
Who's
average
they?
person thinks meditation is like
Who is they
daydreaming.
though? Who is they, Roy?
Pretty much anybody but a yogi. I mean, every religion has their mystics. You know, if you're Muslim, your mystics are Sufis. You
Mm.
know, if you're Buddhist, your mystics are Zens. If you're Hindu, your mystics are yogis. Um, you know, every religion, even uh, in Christianity, they have their Gnostic mystics. You know, they have and Coptic mystics. But they don't. The average person in the religion is not taught these things. Of course, it's not. It's not just the teacher's fault, although primarily the people aren't interested either. You can't teach people something they're not interested in. So organized religions, I'm not against them. They have their purpose, and they keep the idea of God in front of people who otherwise wouldn't be interested at all. But once you get that zeal, interest, and the desire to learn more and to know God, because it's what you do know is not enough, then you have to get into, you got to find a teacher and you got to get into a path. If you don't call it yoga, it's going to be very similar to yoga. And the nice thing about yoga is that yoga is so old and India has codified it so much that they have definitions and techniques for everything. So all of a sudden, it's not a wish and a hope and a prayer. It's like, okay, if you want to get to this point, you got to do this. If you want to get to this point in consciousness, you have to do that. And do you have to do that? No. But if you don't, you're not going to make the progress that you want to make. You know, people fight these things all the time. I know people will say, well, Mr. Black used to say this. Do you have to have a living guru? And you say, well, he said, you probably don't. He said, anything with God is possible. But then he said, I don't know anyone that's done it without it. And he said, besides, why would you want to make it more difficult on yourself than it already is? So when you really are hungry for these things, then you find someone or you find some scripture that can help you, some spiritual book, some teacher that can help you. It's okay if you don't, though. You know, you got eternity to figure these things out.
You got more lifetimes.
Yeah, you got many as you need.
Yeah.
Eternity is a long time.
Yeah.
And you got to be somewhere.
Well, thanks for hanging out with us for a little bit this afternoon, Roy.
I'm glad where we ended. I think it was great. Oh, absolutely. Thanks for sharing your time and your stories.
Say
It's
hi
been
to
great.
Abby for me.
I
Oh,
will. Say hi to Marianne.
do you know my daughter, Jaylyn? Did you ever meet
Uh,
my daughter?
Yeah, of course.
She's getting married in June.
Oh, congratulations.
Congrats.
That's awesome.
Up in the UP, up in Marquette.
Oh, excellent. Oh, I saw a picture of her with Angie. I'm like, how are these two together? So I know Angie's been
Oh,
in
yeah.
Marquette a long time.
Yeah, she's married with a child and she's pregnant for her second.
An Arctic Circle
Excellent.
wedding.
All right. Hey, give a shout out to your
Yeah.
grandson. Tell us about that because that's a big deal.
Oh,
You're telling me about how their hockey team won. I forget what they
well,
won now.
they won the state tournament here.
Okay.
And then their season ends mid-March, I guess. That's when
Yeah.
they won the state tournament.
Mhm.
And then they shuffle the cards a little bit. The state forces them to AAA teams to have tryouts.
Yeah.
They changed a couple players on the team, not many. They're a pretty good team. And so they went to Chicago, a big tournament in the spring in Chicago. 5 of the 6 top teams in the US were there, and they actually won the tournament. We had a
That's
great
awesome.
time.
Who does he play for? Little Caesars or Beltire or which?
Little Caesars.
Little Caesars. Okay. Very
Bell
good.
Tires was there though.
Yeah.
And did you play for Bell Tire?
I refereed the AAA hockey league.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I was never good enough to play AAA. I don't even know if they had AAA when I was playing, but they probably did.
yeah.
But
I
yeah,
played a little bit in high school, but I was never the caliber these kids are. They're so good.
yeah, that level, they're amazing. They're so fun to
They are
watch.
the way they can skate at 12, 13 years old. It's unbelievable.
And handle the puck and pass and
And
receive
handle
passes.
it.
Yeah, they're great.
Oh, maybe the
They're
Wings will make the
unbelievable.
playoffs next year.
Yeah, if they get
Yeah,
rid of
let's
Larkin.
hope.
Hey, at least the Tigers are
All
playing
right.
some good ball. So
Yeah.
Tigers are in first place. How about that?
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
my sport. I played baseball through college.
Oh,
baseball's
excellent.
my favorite. I've watched almost every single Tiger game.
Yeah.
Yeah, we watched most of them. Yeah.
Well, Roy,
No,
thanks
we don't
again.
watch them completely. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Really
Jim.
appreciate you being on the
Bye-bye.
show. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
All right, it's time for Yogi and the
So
BeachMan.
welcome
Hi,
to
I'm Jim
our
the Yogi.
And I'm Rick
humble
Beach, the BeachMan.
podcast.
We're two
Yes,
Michigan
we
transplants
have
now
fun.
living in Southwest Florida.
In fact, we're cousins born in 1964, just a month
Lovely
apart.
people.
I like to
Yes, we
meditate.
have
And I like to play
fun.
bass in a band.
I'm into
Our
chanting
intention
Om.
is
And I'm into throwing
real
down some classic rock.
to
But together,
make you
we're on a
star.
To promote people that are helping
And
other
by
people.
the
We want to
way
make the world a better place.
One
we'll
conversation at a
stay
time.
as
So
we
sit back.
are.
Turn up the volume.
And get ready to laugh.
Tuesday,
Because we like to have fun
While we spread the love.
interviewing lovely people. Yes, we have fun.